It's go time.
Toronto Argonauts linebacker, Wynton McManus.
Keep everything in-house, and I think that right there is, what allows us to go out on the field and play together. You see this team that competes. You see this team that loves each other. You see this team that loves for their brother to make plays. And, man, it's something special here.
Welcome to Third Down Gamble with your hosts, Don Charbin and Heath Graham.
We are off to the 2024 Grey Cup. It's the Argonauts and the Blue Bombers in a rematch of 2022. Welcome, everyone. Don Charbin along with Heath Graham, as you know. Heath, we've got to unpack two big East and West finals. Probably more stories coming from the East at present, but maybe more will develop out of the West as we move forward. First and foremost, the Argonauts win, but without their quarterback.
That's a big hit for the Argos, especially given how Chad Kelly played against Ottawa in the East semifinal. He wasn't as dominant in this game against the Montreal Alouettes, but it's a far different defense between the Red Blacks and the Alouettes that you're facing as well. This is a big loss, a broken tibia, and the prognosis is it's looking like about a 6 to 9 month recovery for Chad Kelly. They will do some more reassessments here over the next couple of weeks, but that was the initial reaction. Nick Arbuckle will get the start in the Grey Cup. There's been a lot of talk comparing it to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers situation where Kevin Glenn broke his arm in the East semifinal. Now Toronto head coach Ryan Dinwiddie got the start in the Grey Cup. This is a night and day difference, though. That was Ryan Dinwiddie's first professional start in the Grey Cup game. Nick Arbuckle has been around. He's been on several teams. He hasn't elevated himself to elite starter status in the CFL, but he's certainly a capable quarterback. So I would not be sleeping on the Toronto Argonauts. Advantage Blue Bombers, but probably not as big as a lot of people are talking right now.
It was a really sad thing to see, partly because, and this is what shock does, and this is what a competitive spirit does. You can see Chad Kelly coming out of that situation, holding onto his leg, trying to keep it structurally sound so they could walk away from it. That was just heartbreaking because you knew that he was in deep trouble when you saw that foot hit the ground and it started to move the wrong way. The Alouette fans, I do not like the fact that they were jeering and everything while he was being attended and then being pulled from the stadium via the stretcher in the ambulance. He's going to get that kind of vitriol, and he's got to get used to it. Argonauts, his teammates, Nick Arbuckle especially, really spoke up.
First of all, it's a very small minority of fans that probably get out of hand. We know Chad Kelly's a very polarizing figure in the CFL, given what's happened over the last season and a half. But at the end of the day, you never want to see a player hurt. You don't want to see a player's career end on an injury. You want the best to go head-to-head in these matchups. And from that perspective, it's a really tough situation because we're not going to get that opportunity to see Chad Kelly lead his team against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the Grey Cup. I know this isn't the first example of fans in a home stadium, unfortunately, not even just in football, but in various sports, cheering or kind of celebrating when a player gets injured, opposing team. And it is unfortunate to see. I mean, if you don't feel the need to cheer Chad Kelly coming off the field in that situation, it's better to just be silent than to have that kind of negative connotation going in.
I can definitely feel the pain that Arbuckle is feeling too, because granted he's excited now he gets to go into a Grey Cup, but in the same breath he doesn't want to see the guy that he's replacing being carted off on a stretcher. Nick Arbuckle is a really class individual, and for him to speak out, I kind of put some weight to what he had to say. The bench for Toronto came out to rally around their fallen quarterback. That was a classy move. You could hear the tears in the speech that Ryan Dinwiddie gave to Chad Kelly while he was on the field. He was emotionally hurt by all of this as well, that he was losing what would be his top quarterback. However, as you state, and I think you're quite correct, there are parallels to 2007, Ryan Dinwiddie, of course, taking over in that football game, first ever start. This is far different for Nick Arbuckle. He's played enough, and he's played in some big games as well. The Argos aren't as bad off as what people think. And if you look at Nick Arbuckle's season, he hasn't had a bad season when he's come in relief.
He hasn't, and there's two ways for the Argonauts to react to this situation. They can roll over and think the season is over, or they can come together as a team. And if we look at the matchups of these two teams this season, Toronto went 2-0 against Winnipeg. Neither one of those games was high scoring. There was some maybe questionable officiating in the first game that led to the overtime win for the Argonauts. That defense is elite. They have probably the best short yardage defense that I've ever seen in my 40 plus years of watching CFL football. And that can come into play. You know, they've got a dangerous returner in Janarian Grant, so they can flip special teams around on you pretty quickly as well. Like I said, they can't sleep on the Argonauts going into this one. Yes, they have an advantage right now, but they have not found the ability to put up a lot of points against the Argos, and for them to take full advantage, they need to find a way to score.
And I give players credit. I saw the post-game press conference. The commentary coming from Zach Collaros and Kenny Lawler, both were very saddened by the news that Chad Kelly wouldn't be there. When you go to a championship game, you want to beat the best at their best. You don't want to have a diminished capacity team on the other side, because yes, you could maybe win the game and not have to worry about anything. When you look back at it, there's always that question, well, could we have beat them if?
There is, but injuries go both ways as well. We haven't seen Dalton Schoen on the field all season for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. He could be a difference maker. Adam Bighill, Drew Wolotarski, you can go through the list. So there's difference makers on both teams. Starting quarterback, obviously, is that marquee position that everybody's looking at, but there are a lot of players that can determine the outcome of a game.
Yes, I won't argue that. Winnipeg is managed without, especially Adam Bighill. I think that's been their biggest hit. The Blue Bombers have managed well. They've figured it out after starting 0-4. They've gotten now to the Grey Cup championship game. It's their chance now to maybe renegotiate what their legacy is, because it's really interesting when you look at legacy, and maybe is it worth it talking about legacy when you're in the midst of one?
I don't think it is, and I know Mike O'Shea tries to deflect from that as well. But if you look at numbers, there's a lot of talk about the Montreal Alouettes' success of the early 2000s and what they did, but they didn't really win a lot of Grey Cups in there. Again, one of the best teams during the regular season. You saw Anthony Calvillo at his peak as one of the best quarterbacks to ever play the game in Canada. So when you look back from a long way out, you start to talk more about what they have done. But Winnipeg, if they win this 3rd out of 5, it's a lot better look than having a losing record in 5 Grey Cup appearances. And so for that reason, I think they really need to get this win to solidify their legacy. But even getting to 5 Grey Cups, you don't see that often. So you can't take away from what they have done. But championships matter. And for that reason, this win is really important.
It is their 5th straight, as we've indicated. Winnipeg is only the 4th team in CFL history to do this. The Regina Roughriders from 1928 to 32, the Hamilton Tiger Cats from 61 to 65, Edmonton from 77 to 82, and in that mix they won 5 in a row. In those sequences, Regina Roughriders, those 5 in a row, they won none. Hamilton won twice. Edmonton, as I mentioned, 5. Those are the types of benchmarks that you kind of look at. Now, Winnipeg went 5 times in 6 years from 57 to 62. They won 4, and it was the last 4. Edmonton went 9 times in the 70s and 80s, as the aforementioned 6 in a row, 73 to 82, and they won 6 of those 9. Montreal, as you talked about, went 8 times in 11 years, 2000 to 2010, and they won just 3. But all of those teams that won at the end, and everyone thinks fondly because of that.
I think that's a great point. Is it's how you finish as well. So right now they're on a 2-game Grey Cup losing streak, and even though they're at a 500 record, that's a sour taste in their mouth having lost 2 straight.
And just to give you some more context on these Grey Cup appearances, Toronto, this is their 25th appearance as a city. The Argonauts have been there most of the time. Overall, since 1954, the Argos are 8-3. Winnipeg, this is as an entity, its 29th appearance. Since 1954, they're 9-9. So these teams have been there a lot. But it's interesting that the Bombers are 500 and that the Argonauts have an 8-3 record. The other thing to remember is that Toronto comes into this game having won 7 straight Grey Cups and having won 7 straight Grey Cups against the Blue Bombers. The Argos are 1-2 in Vancouver, however, and the Blue Bombers are 2-1 in Vancouver when the Grey Cup is played there.
Those are very interesting numbers, and I know we talked about it 2 years ago when the Argos and Blue Bombers faced each other as well. And that was their first Grey Cup meeting since 1950. So if you want to look at that win streak, it's hard to tell it's a win streak when you're going many decades and into a new millennium. But it is a number that is there, and both of these teams are aware of it. And it's something that the Argos want to see themselves continue, and it's something that the Winnipeg Blue Bombers badly want to stop. And we look at the Bombers overall in their Grey Cup appearances. If they're not playing against Hamilton, they're generally in tough. They have a very good record against the Ticats in Grey Cups and not so great against the rest of the league.
Well, and especially when Winnipeg was out east, they really struggled against the West. They have the weirdest distinction of any Western club, having lost to every other Western team in the Grey Cup. There are other stories in the CFL going forward. The biggest one, I guess, that we can touch on is Barron Miles is out in Ottawa as their defensive coordinator. Now, this on the heels of giving up a huge number against the Argonauts in their final regular season game, and then following that with an even bigger number to finish their season in the East semifinal. Barron Miles came over from Montreal, where he had been their defensive coordinator prior. He is now out of a job. 2 things. Does Barron Miles wind up anywhere else that you can see in the near future? And who are the lead candidates to take over in Ottawa? We won't know anything until after Grey Cup because we're sort of now in a league-wide news silence about this stuff.
I would expect Barron Miles to be somewhere on a coaching staff. I don't know if he'll necessarily jump right back into a defensive coordinator role. That was definitely a weak point for the Ottawa Redblacks this season. I certainly expected more out of their defensive secondary. I know their linebacking core got decimated with injuries, which didn't help either. But offensively, the Redblacks look pretty strong. Special teams, you've got one of the most accurate kickers in Lewis Ward. You've got a return man in Deontay Dedman. And the defense is what really started to cost them games down the stretch. We know there's a couple of coaching vacancies in Calgary right now, but other than that, we don't really know where anything else is going to open up.
That's right. Brent Monson is out of Calgary. There's some talk that maybe Ottawa will knock on his door and see if they can get together with an interview and find out what happens. For the Ottawa, they've got to do something about that defense because, as you said, certainly going into the season, everyone thought that, yeah, this is going to be their strong point. And what's Drew Brown going to do with the offense? Well, it turned out to be the other side. It was Drew Brown in the offense, and the defense couldn't keep up. Barron Miles, he'll land on his feet somewhere. He may not be a D coordinator, as you say, but might be a linebackers coach or a defensive secondary. Mark Washington in Hamilton, does he wind up anywhere? Does he follow Sean Burke to Ottawa and maybe become their defensive coordinator?
That's a possibility as well. We're as much as we're going to be getting into that player movement here shortly, the front office and coaching situations will need to be shored up as well. We know with a new president already in place in Edmonton, they want to move quickly on getting a general manager and shoring up their coaching situation as well. So expect to see some news from them very soon. I believe Chris Morris has mentioned he wants to have a general manager in place here before the end of November, and things will be moving quickly there. We don't know what that means for Jarius Jackson and that coaching staff as of yet. So there's some dominoes to fall there too. And then, of course, you start looking at teams asking permission to speak to other guys. We know names like Buck Pierce continue to come up for coaching jobs. The general managers, if Ted Gavea is a successful candidate, which we think he's going to be in the interview mix, certainly with the Edmonton Elks, does he look at bringing somebody like Buck Pierce along as well? So a lot of things at play here.
That's a very good point. When you hire a GM, they probably go with somebody they know. Now, for Buck Pierce, is this a lateral move or is this a step up? Does he get to be head coach as a result of this? And the Bombers would have to look at permission slips for all of this. Lateral moves, teams are a little bit more hesitant about, but if it's a step up. But Ryan McMaden has said no after the BC Lions have said, you can talk to him to Edmonton. Edmonton got the word back from Ryan saying no thank you.
Yeah, that was an interesting, and I don't know, he is the Lions director of player personnel, so is the GM job a step up with Edmonton? I guess technically from a title standpoint it would be, but it's certainly not the first time somebody has said no. And again, I talked about Buck Pierce. He said no before with an opportunity to interview for the Saskatchewan Roughriders head coach position as well. And sometimes there's a lot of off-field factors that come into play as well. If you've got school-age children and you're happily established somewhere, do you really want to look at moving elsewhere? Does your family stay in that original city and you're on the road all the time? So things like that can come into play as well. And also the level of success of the team that you're on. In this situation, does Ryan McMaden want to leave the BC Lions if he thinks that they are a team that's going to contend for the Grey Cup next year and going into somewhere like Edmonton where you don't know what's on the table for you?
I will argue that just a little bit, and then let's just use Buck Pierce as an example. You can only say no so many times before you're not going to get those opportunities. I understand if you've got a young family, school is very important. Look at Jason Moss and look at the moves he's had to take in the last 3 years, and look where it's got him. He's now head coach in Montreal and doing very well. For Buck Pierce, these doors will not stay open for very, very long. And if he keeps saying no, Saskatchewan, fine. If their circumstances weren't right, that's okay. If he has somebody that he knows from Winnipeg going to Edmonton and then they want him, well, he's got to start thinking about this stuff, because if there's any advancement left, you can't keep turning them down. You have to at one point say, yeah, because Mike O'Shea is not going to be the head coach in Winnipeg forever. Is that his end game? Is he? But we saw what happened with Mark Killam, 20 years in Calgary. He's not their head coach either.
That's what I was thinking as well, is he the succession plan in Winnipeg? Has O'Shea given them some inside information as to how long he wants to do this? But you're right, that Calgary situation, 20 years with the team as the heir apparent for probably the last 4 or 5 years, certainly. And then now on the outside looking in, that was a tough pill to swallow, I think, for Mark Killam. And he was that name that kept coming up over the last several seasons of a guy contending for a head coach job over and over again. Now that he's been cut loose by the Calgary Stampeders, is there interest? We don't even know if there's going to be any coaching vacancies in the league that he can really fight for that head coach job.
In Edmonton, I would be certain that there's going to be an O coordinator that they're going to require, because I don't know if, even if Jarius Jackson gets the head coaching job, if he'll be maintaining that role. And then the second is obviously Ottawa. They've got to hire somebody to run that defense. Does Mark Killam even get considered? Why not? Defense is about strategy, but it's also about how you manage people. And so much of coaching is that nowadays. And from everything that I've ever known about Mark Killam, he is one really good people person.
Hey, this is Reed from the Markcast. You're listening to Third Down Gamble.
We were treated to a couple of entertaining division finals, more so I would say the East final, as it came right down to the wire. We saw the Toronto Argonauts pull off the upset and beat the Montreal Alouettes in Montreal 30-28. What was your biggest takeaway from this one?
The Argonauts managed to score a touchdown on 3 different teams. They first scored with an interception return by Benji Franklin that went into the end zone. They then had Janarian Grant take a touchdown back on a kick return. They topped it off with, I would almost argue, poor time management, but they pulled it off. They got that beautiful catch by DeMonte Coxey right at the half. And so the Argonauts had put up 21 points, and it was all from different parts of their football team, which is something that, if you think back to when Michael Clemens was coaching the team, that's something he wanted. He wanted the defense to score, teams to score, and the offense to score, and he figured that they were unstoppable. The second half, the Argonauts couldn't not get into the end zone, and that was half of that half was with Chad Kelly as their quarterback. They couldn't get in, but they did manage to kick field goals and keep going. Interesting for me, there was a decision taken by the Alouettes to go for 2 when they were down, when they scored their first touchdown to rally themselves back in the game. If they kick the single point, they stay down at 27-23, not 27-22. And that changes the equation when they go back down the field and score again, because now they're playing for a 2 again to tie the game at 30, and that's where they come up short.
Yeah, it's funny when things come back like that. You think at the time going for 2 is the better move, but in hindsight, kicking the singles would have resulted in a tie game, and you're not in that situation. For me, the biggest thing that stood out was the Argos' ability, as you mentioned, to score in all facets of the game. We saw the offense was virtually unstoppable against Ottawa in the semifinal, and that was not the case this time around. Montreal, their defense was giving that Argos offense a tough time. We know Janarian Grant's a game changer. He's proven it again. He's returning kicks for touchdowns at a pace that we've never seen in the CFL, and he continues to do that. And when you get the interception return to go with it as well, the momentum and the way the game can shift is huge, and it forced the Alouettes to try to do more on offense. Sometimes when you're forcing, mistakes happen. This was, like I said, a very, very entertaining game from start to finish. Cody Fajardo's line, there's a couple of interceptions in there. One of them was in and out of the hands of Walter Fletcher. So again, I hate that those stats get hung on a quarterback when he threw the ball perfectly, and his receiver let him down and basically tipped it right into the arms of a Toronto Argonauts defender. I think all in all, a good game from Cody Fajardo. He's again proven that he's not afraid of the big stage in the playoffs. Unfortunately for the Alouettes, they just came up a little bit short.
The Alouettes, though, their biggest problem was turnovers. Well, we talked about the interception by Benji Franklin that went for the score to start this. But then there's a fumble by Walter Fletcher after a big gain. Cody Fajardo fumbles the ball deep in Toronto territory. It seemed like every time there was a turnover, one of two things would happen. They would go for a score or it would take away a score. And for Montreal, when you've got 5 turnovers, it takes me back to when Calgary lost to Edmonton in the 2005 Western Final. Same thing happened to the Stampeders. They were the dominant team on the day, except they turned the ball over 6 times and Edmonton capitalized.
Najee Murray made a fantastic interception against Chad Kelly early in the game, returned it for 48 yards, only to be stripped of the ball, and the Argos recover as well. And I was kind of texting a couple of my U.S. friends from the Football A podcast that are just getting into the CFL, and they commented on the unfortunate turn of events that the Argonauts got the ball back, and I tried to give them a brief history of what's been termed the Argo bounce, and that sometimes these weird things happen, and they often go the way of the Toronto Argonauts.
That goes back to a Grey Cup some 80 years ago, and I believe it was Joe Kroll who fumbled the football. The ball bounced back into his mitts, and he went in and scored a touchdown. Vic Washington did it for Ottawa in the 1968 Grey Cup against Calgary, a lateral that he dropped to the ground, picked it up, and then ran 80 yards for a touchdown for Ottawa. The Argo bounce, I believe it's a thing, because it does seem to follow the Argos around. Chad Kelly was 11 of 22 for 182 yards. He did not have a great day. Now, Montreal's defense can make a lot of quarterbacks look ordinary.
They certainly can, and I think that was a part of this. We saw what the Alouettes defense did last year against Chad Kelly, and that early interception, it was looking like it was maybe going to go that way again. It was uncharacteristic of the Alouettes to turn the ball over as many times as they did. And you have to look at as we talked about all facets of this game, how important all three offense, defense, and special teams were. When your offense is struggling, especially your quarterback, it's up to other people to pick up that slack. And Kadeem Carey, we want to talk about the struggles of Chad Kelly. Kadeem had 12 carries for 92 yards. So the rushing attack was better and can help propel you even when that quarterback struggles.
Yes, and that's why you want to be diverse. This is why you want to have a strong running attack to help if there's some problems with the passing attack. And Kadeem Carey had a decent day, and that made a big difference. Now, let's talk about Tyrese Beverett, who most likely, I think, will win Outstanding Defensive Player. But wow, what a mistake he makes on the last throw in the football game where he takes a really bad interference penalty.
It was unfortunate, and when you've got the backup quarterback in, as it were, for the Toronto Argonauts in Nick Arbuckle, you want to make him make plays because he's coming in cold, and you can't take those kinds of penalties when the other team's trying to run out the clock. It just enabled the Argos to get another first down, a fresh set of downs, and really control the end of this game. Not to take away from Tyrese Beverett, I think he's had a phenomenal season. Mistakes happen. I know he's going to be beating himself up over it as well, but you can't pin a victory or a loss completely on one player when there's so many plays throughout the course of the game. Had that happened in the first quarter, we would have forgotten all about it. It's the fact that it occurred so late in the fourth quarter that it stands out.
Exactly. And I don't think it will demean his or diminish his accomplishments from 2024. He was phenomenal out there. Without him, the Alouettes are probably not in that game to begin with. For the Alouettes, it's going to be a little bit of soul-searching. Certainly when you lose a game that, although they played the role of we're the underdog at home a little too much, they were the favorites going into this football game. They were the team that finished first. But they found out what the Argonauts found out the year before. It's hard to maintain your edge when you clinch early.
Absolutely. And as we shift gears to the West Division final here, this is a prime example of how playing meaningful games right down to the end keeps you focused and driven. We talked about Montreal. They started the season 11-1. Even though they didn't clinch for several more weeks, they really had control of that East Division throughout. Once they did clinch, they had a couple of games that weren't really as important and maybe lost a little bit of focus. They did have a good showing against Winnipeg in the last game of the season that came down to the wire. But I think that was a little bit of loss of focus for the Alouettes, having been so dominant early on in the season, especially the first 2/3 of the season. There was nobody in the league that was anywhere near the caliber of the Alouette.
The team that Toronto will be facing in the Grey Cup has been through that for years, since 2021. They have been the dominant team in the West, home and cooled, and yet have still found a way to win the West Final to get to the Grey Cup.
They have. That's a great point. But as we said, they've lost those last two consecutive Grey Cups as well. It's the rest versus rust that always comes up as a topic of conversation. It was a huge advantage for the Bombers to clinch first place in the West because they looked like a fresh team. And we've talked a lot about the age of that veteran core for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. The ability for them to have that extra week off to rest and get ready for this final, I think, really showed that veteran core showed up and really carried this team to the victory.
In Winnipeg winning 38-22, the score kind of flatters the Roughriders because really Winnipeg was on top of Saskatchewan from the word go. Kenny Lawler got behind a confused defense and scored early and scored often. Zach Collaros, if you remember, if I said that this game gets into being an aerial circus, the Roughriders don't stand a chance. Well, it got to be an aerial circus.
It did, and there's been a lot of talk about Zach Collaros struggling in the playoffs with the Blue Bombers. He's been lights out in the regular season and had a really strong playoff run in 2019, but since then hasn't really put up great numbers. This was what you wanted to see out of Zach Collaros for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, a quarterback rating perfection and over 300 yards passing, 4 touchdowns, The Bombers' offensive line kept him upright. He was hit a couple of times but never sacked. And when you give him the opportunity to see the field, and when you've got players getting as open as Kenny Lawler did, this one, as you said, wasn't that close. The Riders scored a late touchdown to kind of make the score look a little bit less intimidating, but really the Bombers never were threatened from the midway point of the first quarter through the rest of this game.
Trevor Harris. I want to compare his numbers to Cody Fajardo's. Trevor Harris goes 25 of 44 for 283 yards. He does throw a touchdown pass. Fajardo goes 27 of 42 for 330 yards. 3 touchdown passes as well. If you look at those comparators, you would think that they both had a good day, but yet Harris, to me, could not figure out what defense Winnipeg was throwing at them, especially on anything 2nd and 5 or more. He kept throwing it into double and triple coverage, and Evan Holm had a game for the ages.
This Bomber secondary proved that they are elite in the CFL, this West Final. As you said, Evan Holm had one of the best games you will ever see by a defensive back. 4 tackles, 4 pass knockdowns. He was everywhere. Tyrell Ford had a knockdown. Terrell Bonds had a knockdown. Willie Jefferson on that defensive line doesn't show up on the stat sheet if you're looking at tackles, sacks, all that kind of stuff, but 2 key knockdowns as well. I don't think I've ever seen a team with as solid coverage without taking pass interference penalties. Evan Holm took 1 interference penalty when he had kind of fallen, and it was more of a heads-up play that he then interfered with what would have been a wide-open MLS. A heads-up play from Holm, sometimes there are such things as a good penalty. That was the case in that situation. But other than that, they were timing up those knockdowns and those tackles perfect.
There's an interesting compare and contrast to the two defenses, where Saskatchewan played a lot of zone. Winnipeg was able to throw to open receivers, and it's partly because the Rider defenders are looking to see what Claris is doing, and partly because they're not picking up the player as they enter their zone. A zone doesn't mean you just stand in one spot and watch the world go around. You're supposed to move to wherever the receiver is going. If they enter your area, which let's say it's 10 yards by 10 yards or something, then you've got to pick that person up as they're coming toward you. The Riders didn't do that. They just seemed to be watching the game and were confused by what they wanted to do. Where if you look at Winnipeg, yes, they sometimes rush 3. They put 9 behind the line to cover up those lanes. Players were moving around with the Rough Rider receivers, not letting them get open.
A key point in that beating the zone was that third touchdown by the Bombers, the pass to Nick Dembski, where he had Kenny Lawler lined up outside of him as well. As the decoy, Lawler went deep to the corner of the end zone, drew 2 defenders, and Nick Dembski basically just turned around and was right there at the goal line. Ball came to him and he was in. And that was a breakdown of that zone. Claris picked it apart all day long. At any time that there was a space, he was finding it. And he was dumping down to Brady Oliveira when he needed to. One other thing that stood out, we talked about this veteran core for the Blue Bombers, but they also got those young receivers involved. Kevin Clercius had an important catch. Carrick Wheatfall had a catch. Ontario Wilson had a couple of catches. So as much as you relied on Dembski and Brady Oliveira and Kenny Lawler, I think getting those other guys involved in this playoff game bodes well for them to perform in the Grey Cup.
Let's face it, though, the preponderance of activity was with Oliveira, Lawler, and Dembski. The others, yes, they maybe got a catch. There was really no desire other than maybe look to them once in a while just to keep the Rough Riders honest. The other part of this game that we're going to have to discuss, and this was the gamble by the Rough Riders, a 3rd and 4, deep in their own territory at the beginning, fourth quarter. Do you think that was warranted, merited?
I know this is going to be the topic of discussion in Rider Nation for months to come, and Corey Mace, after the game, said he would do it again. In hindsight, it was a bad call. At the same time, your offense has struggled to move the ball all game. If you punt in that situation, there's a likelihood that Winnipeg's going to march down the field and score again because they've been rolling on offense as well. I understand why he made the call. It was probably a little bit early in my mind. I don't know if I would have done it with 2.5 minutes gone in the fourth quarter. I think you want to get into the single digits of time left on the clock before you try something like that. The Riders' offense has to feel that Corey Mace was putting the trust in them to get the job done. From the perspective of having the players back, that shows a lot from Corey Mace. Maybe not the best time to do it.
I hope he doesn't do it a second time, because when you're at your 24 and it's third and whatever, that's not the time to do this. You could say that we're not going anywhere and we needed a spark. Great, that's wonderful. But there are other ways to do that. You could change up your offensive call. You could put in Shea Patterson and let him start the series and see where that takes you. It seemed like it was a rookie coach making a desperate call, and it backfired. Let's face it. The Bombers win the football game right then and there. The next play, Brady Oliveira goes down to the 2-yard line, and Winnipeg is in the end zone within an instant. The mistake was you don't need to do it at this time. There's enough possessions left. But if you're looking for a spark, find something else that doesn't put you in so much peril.
The play call itself was interesting as well. They went for a mid-length pass when they needed 3 or 4 yards. And again, with the way that those Bombers defensive backs were playing, I think it would have been a better call to maybe look at a dump off to somebody like AJ Ouellette, or a timing route on a slant, something that's going to be a quick release. And Harris took a little bit too much time to get rid of the ball and allowed the Bombers to knock it down.
Couldn't agree with you more. Now, you talk about one thing, that would he do it again, and what was your notion of it at the time? And when I was watching the game, watching that decision being taken, I thought, no, this is not right. My experiences just tell me this is not the way you need to do this at this moment. For Corey Mace, he will maybe state that if I had given the opportunity, I will do it again. But most likely, there's going to be a discussion with the general manager after this. And this is what's incumbent upon the Roughriders. You've got to learn from what happened on that football field, because the Winnipeg Blue Bombers dominated the Roughriders. Again, the score doesn't reflect it. But at no point were the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in fear or in peril of losing that football game.
The only part of the game that the Riders really had the advantage of was in special teams. They had a fake punt that they got the first down and led to a touchdown drive. They had a blocked punt on Jamison Sheehan that set them up in great field position. And Lucky Whitehead fumbled a punt as well that gave them great field position. Unfortunately for the Riders, those two, the blocked punt and the fumble, only led to field goals, did not turn into touchdowns. When you're struggling against a team like Winnipeg, when you get the ball on the Bombers' 24-yard line to start the drive and you only gain 1 yard, that's a big failure, and that was, I think, what really let the Riders down.
It's akin to the 2021 West Final, where the Roughriders had garnered 5 turnovers in the first half against the Blue Bombers, and yet we're still in a tight ball game. They had to do more to compete, and getting into the end zone was going to be massive against this Winnipeg team. You weren't going to beat them 18-17. You had to score more points than that. Trevor Harris, you can't necessarily put the blame on him, but I do wonder if he just wasn't making the reads. It was, for whatever reason, he was throwing into coverage time again, and tough passes for Schaefer Baker, for Emelis. They were always in a struggle. Now, Evan Holmes sometimes was there, sometimes he wasn't, but there was still somebody in blue right with them.
There was, and part of that is Jordan Younger's defense, where he drops 9 guys into coverage as well, which gave Trevor Harris fits. When the Bombers did rush more, it was effective as well. Rhett Akramdi had the best game of his CFL career with a big sack and a big tackle of AJ Ouellette in open field. When you're not putting pressure on the quarterback, but you're ready to go on those plays and you're stopping guys for no gain or very short gain, it really put that pressure on Harris to try to make something happen on second down. Keyshawn Johnson had a key drop in the end zone as well, which could have changed the game. It was tough. It was a one-handed attempt, and unless you're Kenny Lawler, it's a tough catch for anybody in the CFL.
Third down.
Grey Cup 111 in Vancouver, and it should be a great night for everybody. Jonas Brothers providing halftime entertainment. A lot of people looking forward to that. A few tickets still available, but not many. And there are a lot of people that have already made their way to Vancouver. The week kicks off, of course, with coaches meeting each other, the teams having some press conferences, and then obviously the CFL awards. Getting to the game itself, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers are installed as, depending on where you look, 9.5 to 10.5 point favorites. That's huge. Now, it's not the first time that they've had that kind of faith going into a Grey Cup final. If you think back to last year, I believe the Bombers were 8.5 point favorites over the Alouettes.
Of the Bombers' 4 previous trips to the Grey Cup here, the only one that they weren't the favorite in was 2019, and they won that one by the biggest score of any of these 4 Grey Cup. I think this is a ridiculous line, given that the last 3 Grey Cups have been very close, one in overtime, the other 2 both coming down to the last minutes of the game as well. I am hesitant to pick the Bombers to cover the spread in this one. I do give the advantage to the Bombers. I believe they will win this game. I don't know if they're covering a 10-point spread. That's a big ask in a Grey Cup game, especially against a defense as stout as what the Argonauts are going to bring. And with that, special teams. We know the Bombers were not great on special teams against the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Mario Alford did not break one for a huge gain, but he had a couple of decent returns as well. And when you've got somebody as dangerous as Janarian Grant, that can close that spread pretty quickly as well.
The game to me is going to be the Winnipeg offense versus the Toronto defense. If you look back at the way Toronto has played in the last 8 weeks, it's been their defense as much as anything that have set the tone. The only time that they capitulated was that last game of the regular season against Ottawa, where Lewis Ward managed some very successful onside kicks, and the Red Blacks were able to score quickly. Other than that, that defense has been stellar. And you think back to that game in Winnipeg, where the Argonauts came in and shut that offense down completely and left the stadium with a win. You didn't need Chad Kelly that night. You may not need him in this Grey Cup if that defense plays that well.
Yeah, I would, as I said, take the Argos to beat the spread and probably take the under, whatever it is in this one. I don't anticipate a high-scoring game. The Bombers' secondary needs to really keep an eye on Mackay Polk. He's the biggest threat in that Argonauts receiving core right now. Other than that, Kadeem Carey can put up some yards as well. So Winnipeg, it'll be interesting to see what Jordan Younger draws up against this Argonauts offense. And on the other side of the ball, we know that Argos defense does not like to give up points. I expect this to be a low-scoring game. I'm going to say it's going to be somewhere, if I have to give a score prediction, somewhere along the lines of a 23-18 Blue Bombers win.
The over-under is 50.5. Jordan Younger is not a guy that dials up the blitz very often. I wonder if he'll do it against Nick Arbuckle. Not that Arbuckle's a rookie, but this is a really big situation to have a start in a game where everything's on the line and you really haven't been their guy for most of the season. Toronto with DeMonte Coxey, Mackay Polk, and Tavares Daniels, 3 great receivers. He'll have an opportunity to beat that defense for Winnipeg. But if Winnipeg, who loves to get you 2nd and 7, 8, and 9, I wonder if they're going to start dialing up some blitzes to make sure they get what they want so they can set up their defense for second down.
One thing they do really well, as we talked about, they often only have 3 defensive linemen and appear to be rushing 3, but they have some great timing blitzes from Retta Cramdy and Tony Jones and that linebacking core, and they can give you fits when you think you've got them figured out. All of a sudden, one of those guys comes flying in on a timing route, and especially Retta Cramdy in this game against the Roughriders. He had 9 tackles and a sack. That's a guy that the Argonauts offensive line is going to have to be very aware of at all times.
And this is the other battle. You've got 2 great offensive lines going toe-to-toe. Each one has all CFL players on it. The game, I think, is going to be, as you say, probably tending towards the lower score, but the odds makers are certainly giving no faith to Arbuckle now that he's running the show. And it's going to be one of those fate things. Can he defy the odds, come out there and do something that his head coach was unable to do in 2007? Although he came very close to doing, if you remember. James Johnson has 3 interceptions, one goes for a touchdown. And that's the difference in that football game against the Blue Bombers in Toronto.
Grey Cups are nothing if not unpredictable, and I'm looking forward to a great game with a fantastic crowd in BC Place Stadium. I think this is going to be a great one, and as we mentioned, this is for the Bombers' legacy. They need to get that 3rd win in 5 to really solidify themselves as one of the great teams.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources of the Canadian Football League and 3 Down Nation. For up-to-date, insightful statistics and analysis, please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com. The CFL on CBC theme music is used with written permission from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean. Follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ThirdDownGamble. Join us again next time. The Third Down Gamble podcast. Audio worth watching.